Romans chapter 6. Romans chapter 6 says, "What shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin, that grace may abound? God forbid. How shall we that are dead to sin live any longer therein?" And then from 1 Peter chapter 4, looking at verse 1, and it says, from the International Standard Version, "Therefore, since the Messiah Christ suffered in a mortal body, you too must arm yourselves with the same determination, because the person who has suffered in a mortal body has stopped sinning, so that he can live the rest of his immortal life guided not by human desires, but by the will of God. For you spent enough time in the past doing what the Gentiles like to do, living in sensuality, sinful desires, drunkenness, wild celebrations, drinking parties, and detestable idolatry. They insult you now because they are surprised that you are no longer joining them in the same excesses of wild living. They will give an account to the one who is ready to judge the living and the dead." And then 2 Peter, looking in chapter 2, beginning in verse 12, "These people, like irrational animals, are mere creatures of instinct that are born to be caught and killed. They insult what they don't understand, and like animals, they too will be destroyed, suffering harm as punishment for their wrongdoing. They take pleasure in wild parties and broad daylight. They are stains and blemishes, reveling in their deceitful pleasures while they eat with you. With eyes full of adultery, they cannot get enough of sin. They seduce unsteady souls and have had their hearts expertly trained in greed. They are doomed to a curse." Verse 15, "They have left the straight path and wandered off to follow the path of Bozor son Balaam, who loved the reward he got for wrongdoing." I want to speak this morning for a couple of moments from this topic. It's got to stop somewhere. It's got to stop somewhere. Tell your neighbor, it's got to stop somewhere. Come on, tell your neighbor, it's got to stop somewhere. And God bless you, may be seated. Bless you. It's got to stop somewhere. Paul has a very interesting task that faces him in this book of Romans, where we have come into the middle of his argument in chapter 6. The 5 verses that precede Romans chapter 6 have dealt with laying the very foundation of the gospel that we preach. You remember that Paul speaks in Romans chapter 1, verse 16, saying, "I am not ashamed of the gospel of Jesus Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believes, to the Jews first and also to the Greek. For by it is the faith of God revealed. The just shall live by faith," are words that are penned in this first chapter. And following this, he begins to indicate how that all humanity has turned its heart against God. And even those that would say that, "Well, I love God, I seek to do his will," he exposes the very thoughts and intents of their hearts by saying human soul. He will introduce to us something that is stronger and more powerful and have more efficacious than the greatest doom that we could ever be destined for. In fact, he will introduce to us in these first couple of chapters of the book of Romans something that astronomically exceeds anything that we could have imagined, and that it takes away from us the very death that we so richly deserve. Because those of us that have already peeked into this book, or perhaps have heard it already, know that the wages of sin is death. But he's going to introduce to us in this book something that's more powerful and stronger than death. He's going to show us something that is able to counterbalance the immensity and the power of God's justice. He will reveal to us in these first couple of chapters of Romans the grace of God. Somebody say the grace of God. The grace of God, the unmerited favor of God, where it is that God comes down and gives to mankind something that he does not deserve. The gift of God, as it is called, the gift of God, which will result in eternal life, which is able to counterbalance somehow, some way, irrespective of everything that mankind has in his history and his propensity, and even, dare we say, in his future. God is able to step in and say that man can now be justified. But the justification of which Paul speaks is not a justification that results from the keeping of the law. The justification of which Paul speaks is not a justification that comes because man has done the right thing. Because man on his best day is still far, 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 far from the holy nature of the eternal God. But rather what Paul begins to do is give us a history of Judaism, a history of the account of one named Abraham, and shows us that by faith, that Abraham's faith was counted unto him for righteousness. And so what he introduces to us is a justification or a righteousness that comes not by the keeping of the law, but that is imparted or imputed into mankind's account simply by faith in the God that raises the dead. Anybody have faith in the God that raises the dead? And so what he begins to do here is tell us how that we had no hope of redemption. We had no hope of life because we were absolutely and undeniably dead. And the only thing that can introduce life into something as dead as we were was the power of God that's stronger than death, that's able to raise us up by some miracle and give us quickening power. And so the text says, and you have been quickened who were dead in trespasses and sins. And so he quickens us and he makes us alive, and we realize and recognize that of our own accord we were able to do nothing to affect this change. We were able to do nothing that would cause this to take place in us. No, it was the divine initiative of a mighty and a powerful God that was able to lift us up from that sea that we sang about this morning. I was sinking deep in sin, far from a peaceful shore, very deeply stayed within, sinking, and the destiny was to rise no more. But the master of the sea heard my despairing cry, and from the waters he lifted me. Now saved me alive. That doesn't sound like a testimony of someone that was able to dust off their bottoms, get themselves together, and now come before God and say, God, I present myself to you. But rather it is the story of one who was desperately and hopelessly lost, who was blind but is now able to see, who was lost and now God finds them and enables them to step into this thing called grace. But Paul has a very interesting challenge now, because what he has done is actually stripped away from mankind the ability to ever earn right standing with God. What he has done is actually said that mankind, no matter what you do,